fantasy genre is wide and diverse, but it has a few select giants in the industry that have grown to be what people think of when they imagine it. The two giants that myself and many others think of are Harry Potter and Star Wars. Both fandoms boast incredible numbers of sales and merchandise and theme parks. Each has their own ocean of fan fiction, and they find themselves competing for dominance in the theater of fantasy. With both giants being so well known and popular, some people have pointed out similarities between the two franchises, and some of these similarities have led people to conspire that Potter stole elements from Star Wars. Did Star Wars inspire J.K. Rowling? Did she steal elements from Star Wars? Can we chalk up the similarities to the stories being some generic story arc? In this video, we'll dive into all these questions and find answers to set the story straight. Star Wars, after its initial release in 1977, was revolutionary for the fantasy world. For the first time, licensed memorabilia were being mass-produced and mass-marketed in a totally unique way. The space science fiction world was totally revived by the success of Star Wars, paving the way for what has become one of the most marveling templates for fiction today. Star Wars even changed how movie studios released movies by being more focused on giving viewers summer blockbusters instead of leaving the summer as a dry season for movies. This pioneered the way that studios would approach their major releases. Star Wars was absolutely a pivotal addition to cinema, and as a result, everyone who knows movies knows Star Wars. It goes without saying that J.K. Rowling most likely knew what Star Wars was before she wrote her first book. Most of the people who theorize that Rowling may have copied the Star Wars saga will allude to this when calling Harry Potter a Star Wars ripoff. So, what are they talking about when they call Harry Potter a ripoff? Admittedly, the similarities between these two stories are striking. We will begin with the similarities between the characters in each franchise. The biggest two characters, Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker, are two very similar characters. Proponents of this argument will claim that Harry is a copy of Luke because they're both orphans who lived with their aunts and uncles that knew of their magical importance. Harry was delivered to his aunt and uncle after his parents died to keep him safe as a child. Luke was also delivered to his aunt and uncle after his parents died to keep him safe. On top of this, both people were delivered by a bearded character who would live on to become their mentor later in the story. People compare these two characters, Dumbledore and Obi-Wan Kenobi, because they both serve as the boys' father figures and mentors. They even look somewhat similar with how they're both older and bearded. Even the enemies can be compared quite closely in these two stories. Both the stories have a main enemy and an enemy that stands by the enemy's side. In Harry Potter, Voldemort can be compared to Palpatine because both are power-hungry figures that have facial deformities. Each of them is hard to kill and spends most of their time on screen or in the page being rivaled by few except for the main heroes. Each have insane knowledge of the dark arts that they have earned from their desires to be the most powerful. These villains would not be as dominant without their best right-hand man. In both franchises, there is a villain that stays by the side of the main antagonist. In Star Wars, we have Darth Vader, and in Harry Potter, we have Snape. These characters are each built on the grief of losing the woman they loved and possess great power to support their superior. In each story, both characters are also redeemed by doing things that could be considered honorable or beneficial for the protagonists. Both characters have best friends, too. Harry has Ron and Luke has Han. Ron and Han rhyme, some people have alluded to that as well. Each side character also has a love interest that is one of their friends. Ron has Hermione and Han has Leia. People rooted for Luke and Leia, and people also rooted for Harry and Hermione, but both stories led the side characters to them in what ended up being the fan favorite couple. Another character similarity that is commonly noted is the similarities between the main character's helpful old friends. C-3PO is often compared to Dobby because he is a gentle character that spends most of their time on screen looking out for the hero. Aesthetically, these two characters are not very comparable, but their function in the stories bears most of the similarities. They can be annoying, but both characters are very intelligent and caring and will provide help to the two characters whenever it's needed. R2-D2 and Hedwig, the other companions, are also compared due to their similarities in roles. Both friends are small, nonverbal, and were seen to be canonically assigned to the main characters because of a special connection with their master that led the two to be some of the most deeply connected characters in each story. It's hard not to root for the two of them. Chewbacca and Hagrid are also often compared, but this time visually and in terms of their purpose for the story. Because they are nature-loving and always have their big hearts on display, a lot of people have drawn comparisons between them. Even components of the story have striking similarities, with each of the main characters being orphans, which plays a large role in their character development. Both main weapons of the franchises are sticks that are only powerful when an ancient magic is learned by the user, At the end of both stories, the main character realizes that the main bad character has some deep connection with him, and it shows that the character's wish of finding solace was never going to be accomplished with defeating the enemy. The similarities do not end there, but I have bad news for conspiracy theorists and competitors in the Potters vs. Star Wars debates. The reason that these two stories are so comparable is not because J.K. Rowling wanted to steal the ideas from the biggest fantasy franchise of all time. It's because both follow possibly the most used story trope in human history. That's right, there's no deeper conspiracy as to why these two stories have so much in common. It's all the hero's journey. The hero's journey story trope is one that has been used since people began telling stories. Stories as old as Theseus and the Minotaur use a template for the development of a story that fits both Harry Potter and Star Wars almost exactly. The hero's journey usually consists of the same storyline. It begins in the ordinary world, where the hero is nothing more than an ordinary person in a familiar place. Then, the story progresses to the call to adventure, where the hero gets introduced to a larger task. From there, the hero is hesitant in the refusal to call, but the introduction of a mentor and moving away from the familiarity occur in the steps meeting the mentor and crossing the first threshold. Tests, allies, and enemies follow closely when the hero makes friends and moves through roadblocks that present themselves as the story gets interesting. When the hero is getting closer to the goal, this is what's called the approach to the inmost cave. When the hero meets its largest battle or task, this is called the ordeal. The reward or seizing of the sword is when the main character wins what they think is the largest battle, only to be shown the roadblock and resurrection, where the journey is shown not to be over yet. Then, the hero crosses the final finish line of defeating the biggest enemy. The story typically concludes with the main character returning home or to a different form of familiarity with the return to Elixir. If you imagine the instances of both Harry Potter and Star Wars, you can see that both are not like each other. They're like this story structure. In fact, not only are these two stories like the hero's journey story structure, but there are also hundreds, maybe thousands of other stories in our mainstream culture that follow this. To name a few, there's The Hunger Games, Game of Thrones, The Left Hand of Darkness, and even some older, more classic stories like Homer's Odyssey and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Stories, since they have been told, have all followed these template-like tropes that create a classic feel for the reader or watcher. The reason they use these structures repeatedly is not because they're piggybacking off the success of the great stories to do it previously, but it is because they're understanding that people want to see these stories take place. Harry Potter and Star Wars are not the same story. In fact, they have enough differences that people overlook due to the similarities being so glaring. In Harry Potter, the story takes place in a real-world adjacent Earth that is most likely in the early 90s. Harry Potter fans have raved about how homey and warm the entirety of the books and films feel because it is close to home. In the galaxies far, far away, Star Wars does not give their audience the same feeling. Star Wars takes place all throughout a fictional universe with constant jumps between settings when the characters fly between the different planets. Harry Potter takes place within the same world and environments with mostly the same feel. The medium in which both of these stories debut is also a difference that can be noted. Harry Potter was first told in a book, which allows for more creativity with the reader and for more of a story to be told because it does not have to fit within a certain time range of a human's attention span. The stories are told completely differently because of the way they are both first presented. True fans of Potter have always raved about how the books are the most in-depth version of the story, and in Star Wars, the books that follow the story are commonly known as shortcomings in their franchise. Harry Potter's whole concept of Neville, a character who is largely considered the other candidate to be chosen, is not necessarily a storyline explored in Star Wars. One could argue that there is a chosen one for every generation in Star Wars, but the purpose of this argument is to show that Rowling is introducing things that are large parts of her story that are not fully developed story arcs in Star Wars. Harry Potter also uses mostly human characters in their story. There are few characters in Harry Potter, like the house elves and large birds, that extend to outside of humans. In Star Wars, though, the universe is very diverse, and there are all sorts of languages, species, and other sorts of intelligent life and livestock that are all embedded within the culture behind how Star Wars was successful. one might also point out how Star Wars presented their story. First the main story, then the prequels, then the sequels. This is very different from how Harry Potter told its story, because there was originally no form of prequel or sequel that we would have been given. Some point out that this makes Harry Potter way more easy to follow, as the whole story is laid out beginning to end and is made under the same directors or authors. Harry Potter's story is typically understood as complete and traveling chronologically. I think that there could be a bigger argument for Rowling plagiarizing Star Wars if the story structure of Potter was laid out the same way Star Wars was, with the story being told out of order. These stories may have similar components, but the meat and potatoes of each story are completely unique to themselves and individual. Comparing Star Wars and Harry Potter is easy for fans to do because both stories have been criticized and loved equally, as they are both the giants of the fantasy genre today. In the world of technology and conspiracy, people have loved to claim that Potter's story was heavily influenced by Star Wars because of the long list of similarities between the two stories. There are characters who align strikingly close, concepts that seem to be borrowed, and props that fans think may be too close to not call separate. There is an explanation for all the comparisons. A hero's journey is a route stories have been taking since the beginning of all stories being told. The great poet Homer, ancient writers like Theseus and Aristophanes, and even modern writers that write some of the biggest stories in our culture use this structure and are not accused of copying others. Rowling did not copy Star Wars in her writing of Potter. She did not steal any parts of the story, and she is worthy of all the praise she received for writing her unique story that has changed the trajectory of literary fandoms forever.